Welcome everyone to another episode of the Terrain Studio. I'm your host, Sean Morris. Today on the Terrain Studio, we're going to be talking about foam, specifically extruded polystyrene or pink foam, blue foam, whatever you kind of call it. So before you hear, I have a couple examples of some pink foam sizes. I won't be using any blue foam for the purposes of this video, but basically the difference of those is the manufacturing plant or the company that produces it. So if you're able to get blue foam, you can translate that into the pink foam that I'm using. So all the same sort of rules, tips, applications will still apply to both blue foam and pink foam. If you're using the white ball type styrofoam, that won't apply to most of what I'm talking about. So just for the purpose of this video, just exclude that. And I'm going to be talking specifically about the higher density foam that is the pink or the blue. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to break it down into sections. We're going to talk about adhesion. We're going to talk about prep. We're going to talk about a little bit of working with the foam in terms of repairs, cuts, how to manipulate the foam to kind of do things that you want. I'll talk about some tools that you can use to manipulate or shape or carve the foam. And then I'll just talk about some general properties or principles around the foam, and then some of the ways that you can combat maybe some of the things that you might run into in terms of warp or adhesion issues or even, like I said, damage repair. So let's just talk about the availability of, or the standard availability of most of the foam. So primarily when I go to the hardware store, which is where I purchase it, I will find a couple type sizes, and these are the four sizes that I have readily available to me. So we have the half-inch foam here, we have the 1-inch foam here, the 1.5 inch, and the 2-inch. So the half-inch and the 1-inch are pretty standard. They'll come fairly squared up, roughly in about 96 inches by 24-inch sections. However, I would recommend throwing a tape measure on those because those measurements can sometimes vary. Oftentimes they'll be a little bit shorter than 24 inches, like 23 3/4. So if you're using a 2-foot tile or trying to use 2-foot measurements, you may find that your seams don't exactly line up. So definitely measure that. Other than that, the half-inch and the 1-inch are pretty standard. When you start moving into the 1.5 inch or the 2-inch foam, some of the things that you're going to notice are one, the sizes may vary. You can actually get the 4-foot sheets. So typically in the thicker ones, you'll be able to get 4-foot wide sheets, and that may be beneficial to you. Also, what you're going to notice is that they're going to have this sort of lip here. And this is important to note because the lip will be staggered. So on this side here, if I'm holding the foam, the lip will be here with an overhang, and on the opposite side, the lip will come on the bottom with the overhang sort of here on the top. And that's designed to sort of fit the sheets in together. The important thing to note, though, however, is that when you go to cut it, you'll have to consider the inside dimensions as being kind of the widest point. With the 2-inch foam, you can probably get away with having this 1-inch section here. The overlap's not too bad. However, if you're using this for a structural piece, the half-inch overhang may break off or may not be as strong as you're looking for. So there's a couple things that you can do to kind of prepare or work around that. Primarily what I do is I actually just take a knife and I just cut that off, and I just work with the bulk of the material. Likewise, I do that with the 2-inch. That's my preference. However, if you want to kind of like interlock some pieces, obviously these pieces are the same size, but if you want to kind of interlock and create sort of a strength point or an adhesion point here between two sheets, you can certainly do that. Just account for the fact that you will in fact have the lip. So that's kind of the basic sizes. So I've just sort of cut these down to be workable, manageable here on camera. And before we kind of get into more about the foam, I wanted to just spend a brief minute talking about the substrate that you may or may not be working with. So typically I use these foams for various things. So I'm going to kind of start there. So this right here, this half-inch foam, I often use this as a top layer if I'm working with a thicker MDF base, and I'll address that in one moment. The 1-inch foam also I use often as a base material, and I use that typically if I'm working with a thinner MDF base. The 1.5 inch and the 2-inch foam I rarely use as a substrate base, basically because I find that they're kind of overkill in the sense that they're really too thick for what I need. However, I will caveat that with, depending on what structural or topography you're trying to incorporate into your table, you may actually want to move to the 1.5 and the 2-inch foam. And we'll kind of talk about that throughout the video. So when I'm talking about a substrate, I'm talking about the surface layer that I'm going to work on. So here before you, I'll just move the foam aside, we have a couple different substrates that you may want to consider working with. So they're all actually technically the same material, so they're all MDF. However, they're various thicknesses. This piece here is actually a 1/2-inch piece of MDF, and I really like the 1/2-inch to work with. It's a nice sort of middle of the road. You can certainly get thicker. However, with a 1/2-inch, I typically can avoid any warping at all, and that's really important for me. One of the sacrifices that you're going to make, however, is the fact that this is actually going to be quite heavy. It's actually a really dense material. So if weight is an issue, if you're shipping or if you have to move it around and you have issues with lifting significantly heavy items, I'd probably avoid the 1/2-inch. However, you can make it really simple on yourself, cut it into 3 sections so that you have kind of 2x3 sections. Or something similar to that, whatever configuration you want, but the more cuts you have, obviously the lighter each piece is. So I will often laminate a 1/2-inch piece of foam on top of a 1/2-inch piece of MDF, giving me a 1-inch base material to work with. It's more than adequate in terms of stability. I find that I can still cut in some topography into the 1/2-inch without cutting right down to the MDF. However, I'm not left with a lot of excess foam. If you're working with smaller materials, so for example, I often work with 1-foot squares. These are actually 3mm MDF. So the 1/2-inch foam laminate still works on here. However, with the 3mm, sometimes you can get a little bit of warp, and I'll talk about why that exactly happens in another segment of the video. However, sometimes this doesn't end up being the most stable, so you may want to have a little bit of a thicker substrate. So this is where I'll often go with the 1-inch on top of the 3mm MDF, just to give me a little bit more of a substantial piece. It just feels a little bit better, it holds up a little bit better. And because I often have MDF plates on the side as well with the magnets, I get a little bit of extra thickness, but I'm only using 16mm or roughly around a little over a 1/2-inch. So it ends up being about 1.5 inches, a little bit thicker with the smaller material. If you're going to do any sort of area terrain or scatter terrain, again, I use 3mm MDF for this just because I'm trying to keep the profile quite low to the table. 1/2-inch foam works really good if you have something really low cut. Basically, this I would use if I was going to adhere something else to this piece. However, if you want to kind of create any topography in here, what I do recommend is going either with a 1 inch or 1.5 inches. And then this way, what you can do is you can start sort of cutting or carving away the material to give you a little bit of substance still on top of here. The same would apply with really low scatter. I will talk about how to properly adhere so that you don't get any warp. One of the things I would avoid is using any of the thicker foam on really small pieces of MDF. That's actually because the thicker the foam sheets or the larger the foam sheets, they actually have a residual memory, and oftentimes they have a little bit of a bow to them, just given the nature of the material and the span of the material. And specifically with 2-inch and the 1.5 inch, if you were to, and it's really hard to see, but there's a real subtle bow right here. However, if I was going to glue this and adhere this onto here, what can actually happen is because this is so thin, the foam itself can actually pull back the MDF, and you'll either get a flexing or you'll get a warping because the foam itself is actually stronger than the MDF, and you'll get some, like I said, you'll get some pulling or some flexing, and then you'll end up with a gap underneath, which we always try to avoid in terrain making. So I'm going to talk about how to sort of avoid that, but one of the straight avoidance techniques is to not use super thick foam on small or thin based materials. So let's go ahead and set all those aside and just sort of lay out the next step of the video. So obviously, once you get your foam selected, you know, what size are you looking for, what is the purpose of the build, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that right now. We've talked about this as substrate. What am I using these for if I'm not using them for substrate? These are what I use typically to build my features. So if I'm building something, let's say a hill or a rock type structure, I'll often want to layer up several layers of foam. Now I can layer 1/2 inch, that's fine. It's going to give me a lot of lines. So if you're looking for something striated, maybe 1/2 inch would be usable. However, if you're kind of going for a gradual hill or a more rock-like structure, you want to minimize the number of unnatural seams, meaning the seams where the foam comes together. So typically, I will use 2-inch foam. That allows me, especially in Star Wars Legion, where the 2-inch foam kind of allows me to control that height. So 3 stacks of 2 is going to be a height 1. Any more than that's going to be above height 1. You can kind of work with simple math based on your layers, and you'll kind of know the feature will be either height 1, above height 1, or whatever you so desire. Truthfully, I'm looking to avoid as many seams as possible. If I'm doing something more vertical in terms of a tall structure, or let's perhaps say a bridge or an arch, the natural tendency for us when we build things is wanted to sort of block up and build things, probably how we played with things when we were children. We sort of blocked things. If they fit nicely, we stack them. However, I would caution around the strength of this, and the reason being is if I were to cut an arch out of this, what I would have is very narrow sections right here, and then the top of my arch ends up having some real thin sections. If you cut it into a 2-inch, the same thing, you're gonna have a thin section here. So what I would often recommend doing is if you're gonna do any vertical structures or anything that you require some stability, consider turning your foam this way. You can still laminate your sections. So here I have multiple sections laminated. I envision using 2-inch ones here, but if you laminate your sections together, then what ends up happening is when you go ahead and then cut the arch in here, you have a lot more stability here in terms of the strength. The foam has a natural tendency to want to flex. You can see I can flex this 1/2-inch piece quite substantially. Less so with the 1-inch, very little with the 2-inch. However, to try to flex the foam like this is nearly impossible. There's almost no ability to flex. So you can imagine as you laminate pieces together, the ability to flex or break an archway would be nearly impossible. So that's a strong consideration. So we're going to move on to the next section, but here's where I want you to kind of sort of delineate in your video in terms of starting to think about what is the purpose, what am I trying to do? Am I going to focus on the substrate level? Am I focusing more on structural? And take that information with you through the rest of the steps, because each of the steps will likely apply very similarly. However, you may want to, in your own mind, start making adjustments for what exactly am I intending to do with foam. Am I working just on a wood base with foam on top? Am I working with a wood base with a foam substrate and adding foam to it? There's lots of considerations to make there. I won't be able to cover all of that in the video, but I am hoping to kind of provide you with some general tips and some user guidelines in terms of working with foam and kind of eliminating that fear of using foam as a substrate. And I think that foam is one of the best materials you can possibly work with. It's not 3D printing, it's not working with plastic, but you can get a lot of natural and organic shapes with foam, and I think you guys will be excited about the rest of the video, so stay tuned. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to know how to do with foam is how to cut it into shape, how to get it into a more manageable section. It's clearly a 6x2 sheet or an 8x4 sheet of foam is not going to be adequate in terms of like working. It's not going to be easy to manipulate. So one of the things that we want to do is figure out how do we get this to a workable shape that's still going to allow us to sort of define the areas. We don't want to cut off too much. We don't want to try to do everything in one step. And one of the things that I often employ here, and you guys have seen or heard me talk about this before, is my Proxxon foam cutter. So I'm going to show you real quickly what the Proxxon does in terms of ease. However, if I'm talking about working with foam, although this is not the Cadillac version, there's certainly more expensive foam cutters. It certainly does make the process super easy. So it's my Cadillac here in the studio. So it's really simple. You just sort of turn on your cutter. You have your guide here. You run it through. You make sure that you set the heat for the appropriate gauge of foam or the depth. So here I'm having it quite warm because I'm cutting a 2-inch piece of foam. I'm just going to show you kind of how slick and easy this whole process is. Perfect. Turn this off and we get a super thin clean cut. It eliminates a little bit of material obviously with the burning. However, if I do want to sort of marry up those two seams afterwards, it's very easy to do so, and you can see how clean and precise that is. However, let's just pretend for a second that we don't all have Proxons sort of at our disposal. So let me set this aside, because the reality is that we're not all going to have that, and specifically if you're just starting with foam, you're probably not going to run out and grab that. However, what you probably do have access to are cutting instruments. So here what I have is just 4 common instruments that you may or may not have available. So this is actually a Woodland Scenics foam cutting knife, and you're going to notice that it has a long blade. This is set specifically to cut through various depths of foam. The blade has a little flexibility to it, however it's quite rigid, and it's a little bit thicker than most X-Acto knife blades. This here is just your standard hobby knife, an X-Acto scalpel. Has a rounded blade on here. It's quite short and it's very thin and narrow. Okay, so what we have here is the more heavy duty X-Acto knife, the Fat Max by Stanley. Again, it's just your standard X-Acto knife. You can extend the blade to various lengths. However, when a blade is extended on an X-Acto knife, you're going to notice that there's a ton of deflection here in the blade, and this is really important to consider when you're cutting on your foam. So let's we'll tuck that back in. And then finally what I have here is just a hobby saw. This has a rigid back, so it's designed to keep the deflect to a minimum, and it has teeth. Now I'm not going to say that I recommend all of these, however I'm going to show you what each of the instruments do just for the purposes of the video. So let's just start with the saw, and we'll go back to the 2-inch piece that we had. So let's just imagine for a second that you're trying to make a cut, and we really probably should have a straight edge for this. Grab some sort of straight instrument here. So let's just say, for example, I'm trying to cut, and I want to make a cut right here. You can mark it with a pencil or something. I'm just going to use the saw to do that. So here's my line. So let's just say, for example, I want to cut through here. So I'm just going to do that for you. So this works. However, I'm getting down to the back of the saw, and now I have an issue because I can't get this to go all the way through. So now I'm going to invert this. I'm going to line up as best I can. Again, I can use the same measurement, no problem. So I'm just going to use that. And then I'm going to cut through. Okay, so that works. There's a couple problems with this. One, you can see how this is not nice and clean, like I just showed you. Secondly, if I fit these 2 pieces back together, let me use this side because it's a little clearer. You can see that as I was cutting down through, although I was keeping the blade as straight as possible, the teeth were gripping in and it was starting to deflect. So I have this really weird sort of crested cut. It fits together fine. So really they marry up well. However, if I was looking for a nice clean board edge, I did not achieve either one with a serrated blade. So I do recommend not using any serrations or any teeth on anything. So let's just continue going so we don't wreck a bunch of pieces of foam, because I want them for other parts of the video. Let's move over to the Fat Max, same sort of deal. So I'm going to cut through. I'm going to do this, I'm just going to mark it first. So I'm going to cut through the more normal way, or the way I find people try to do things first. So they're going to line that up, and you're going to cut. You're going to extend the blade because you know you have to go real thick because it's a thick piece. You're going to plunge it down, and then you're going to pull it. You're going to pull it through, and that gives you a fairly clean cut. However, what you're going to notice is that it grips, pulls, and gouges the foam. And that's because you're actually putting so much strain on the inside as you displace the foam that you're creating these pockets where it's just going to, the tension's going to build, and then it's going to break away. Now, what I recommend doing is, if you're going to use this type of knife, is that first make a little scoring cut. Don't plunge your blade as deep as possible. Just maybe go like half a thickness. And I actually like to work a cut through. Now, I'm going to show you in a second why this is also not perfect. So again, then I'm going to bring the blade out a bit more. I'm not trying to bore you with the cuts, but I do want to explain the differences. So again, it's clean to a certain extent. However, I achieve the same problem. I'm trying to displace so much foam with this knife. And the problem also is that the deflection. So when you're pulling through nice and clean, you're getting a nice clean cut. You're not displacing a lot of material. However, the deeper you go and you start getting some flex with this blade, is it starts to gouge out the sides, and then you get kind of this not so nice looking material. If you go slow and you sort of work your blade down through, just sort of letting the weight of the knife do work, you can avoid that to a certain extent, but you can see even with the slow placement, as soon as the blade starts to deflect, as it gets deeper and deeper, you start getting this gouging. So again, not recommended to use this knife. If you're talking about rough cuts, like let's say you're at the hardware store, you got to break this sucker up to get into your car, yeah, grab this, slice it down, snap it, you're good to go. And I'll talk about kind of snapping this material as well. Matter of fact, I'll show you that right now. So let's just say, for example, I'm just going to plunge this down and I'm going to work it back and forth. So this is a fairly thick piece of foam. It's a 2-inch piece of foam. I've gone roughly half the thickness. I'm going to now show you that you can in fact snap it. And you're gonna have a distinct difference in the look. Here's the cut, no displacement because I sawed it down through it, didn't put any pressure on it. However, when I snap it, I get a much more rough texture. This texture is your friend if you're trying to texturize the foam and do some rough like rock faces or things like that. So I do recommend using this snapping technique. However, I don't recommend using this if you're kind of preparing foam for a specific terrain project. So we've got lots of pieces here now, and so we're at the end of this test for this big guy right here. The Stanley knife, again, it's a usable tool, versatile tool in the terrain studio, probably not the best for prepping foam. Let's just continue working with the foam pieces, but let's move to something a little bit smaller just for the purposes of this next part. So let's move down to 1.5 inches. So let's just say, for example, you're trying to prepare the 1.5 inch foam and you only have a small knife like this, and you kind of want to, line up one cut on one side and just sort of do your best to line it up on the other. Now, this knife here, I'm just going to do that scoring cut. This knife here will do a couple things better than the Stanley knife. So I'm just going to drag this through. And these blades are all sharp, FYI, just in case you were thinking that it's a dull blade. So here's the problem. I get down here, I'm trying to score along, I'm trying to plunge the blade as deep as I possibly can. A couple things happen. It's a little hard to see, but what happens with these blades is that they typically have a rounded top or a pointed top right where the blade connects to the shaft. And what you end up doing is you actually end up pressing the indentations into the foam, which are not great. I did a pretty good job cutting this straight up and down. However, now I have to try to line it up to the other side. So I'm going to do my very best. I'm just going to freehand this. You could take as much time as you want with this, but I think what ends up happening is you have the exact same problem. So I'm just going to put this straight edge on here again, score a line in, and then we'll go ahead and try to cut through as best we can, just sort of lining this up. So I'm just trying to keep it straight. If I use the straight edge, I could definitely keep the blade straighter. However, the more the straight edge when I lay it down, that means the blade's even farther up and I don't get to make the plunge cut as far as I want. So I'm just going to continue to run this through. I am cutting towards me, however, I'm sitting about 2 feet back from the table just for safety purposes. So now I've got almost all the way through. However, I've maxed out my blade and I can't get it to cut. So now I need to do a snap. So it's fine. I snap it. However, look at this. It's not awesome. Because I can't get this very thin blade to line up in the exact same side or the exact same groove from top to bottom, I get a little bit of an issue here. Not only that, but I got some tearing, I got some break point where I flexed it. It just didn't end up working as good. This can be adjusted. Let's just say I'm working with a 1/2 inch foam, so I'll give it kind of a break and I'll go down to a thickness that I can plunge all the way through. If you are nice and careful, and again, I'm just going to use my straight edge, but my straight edge kind of gets in the way. I'll switch this over. If you are in fact careful and work slowly enough, you can in fact make an X-Acto knife blade work. Set this aside. I'm just gonna sort of score this through. hit a few pockets. So again, you can make it work, but it's generally not going to give you a nice clean cut, because what happens is you hit pockets of density on this foam. So I'll just show you. I'm just going to do a couple more small cuts. So no matter how nicely I work through, I'm just going to hit some dense pockets. It's just really, really tough to make nice and clean cuts. I'll show you how to clean this stuff up if you end up having this, but again, it's just not the recommended tool. It's too short. It's too difficult to go through anything that you have to try to line up two cuts, and I just don't recommend it. So where's my recommendation lie? My recommendation lies with an actual foam knife. This is made for cutting foam. It's got a couple things that are going for it. This blade is very small and it's more for precise work. And so because it's very thin, if it doesn't line up perfectly, you can definitely see that. This has a thicker back to the knife blade. It's also got the depth that you're looking for. In addition, it has the thicker blade, so you will displace a little bit more material. However, it's shaped in such a way that it'll actually push the displacement without tearing. So let's just go back to something that we've already used. So I'm going to go to this piece right here. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of score a line in there where I want to cut, using the weight of the blade. And I'm not above this at all, so I'm sort of cutting towards me, but not doing it perfectly. So there, that's the difference of those two, and that's through the thicker material and like basically, like I said, the weight of the blade. I wasn't above it, wasn't proper control or anything like that. Let's go through the 1/2 inch. Okay, score line, drop that down, plunge it along. There you go. A much cleaner cut. It almost looks as clean as the Proxxon, to be honest. Put it back together. It's quite straight. There's very little issue with the angle of this, and I did that freehand with no straight edge. You'll notice that time. So as soon as you lay a straight edge, you're able to kind of control that a bit more. And I'll show you also how this blade works really well with a straight edge. So one of the issues that we had when we were plunging this knife on here was the fact that, you know, the blade gets caught up along this track. There's not enough clearance. If I put it on here and I'm running along here, even this section creates some issues. However, because this blade has nice thick and long blade, you can run it along your straight edge, and that's what I typically do. I use my straight edge as a guide. I run my blade right along it, and even if I have to change the angle, I can still run that along the straight edge, and I don't have any issues here with blade getting caught up on my straight edge. Even if you run it along the longest piece right here. In fact, I highly recommend that. So what I'm effectively doing is I'm using my straight edge and I'm backing it against the knife so that when I'm plunging it through, and this is kind of a good profile shot, when you're cutting with your knife, you're not looking to do this. You don't want to drag it along because that's going to create you problems. You want to angle your blade along, and you want to make sure that you're cutting not in a single pass, but several passes to get down through. So for example, I typically try to cut no more than a 1/2 inch each time. So that's a general rule of thumb. If you're cutting 2 inch, 4 passes probably gets you through, maybe 3 if you're changing your angle a little bit. Through a 1/2 inch, you do a score line and 1 cut through. It's perfectly fine. Through a 1 inch, again, you're going to probably use a scoring line and then 2 passes of your blade. If you do that, it's better. If I try to do this aggressively and I try to cut this through a single pass, you will run into the exact same problems because even this blade is displacing too much material in a single pass. So there's a lot of cutting there. However, I think this is probably the most important tool consideration for working with foam. If you don't have a Proxxon cutter, and the Proxxon cutter is not going to be the solution for everything. However, when you get down to making those precise cuts and you're trying to get something into a workable format, the foam cutting knife is going to be your friend. If you have an X-Acto knife with a longer blade, you possibly can get into a realm similar to this. However, I would caution, it's the thickness and the structure of the blade that's important. You have to have very little deflection. Now this blade doesn't have any deflection. However, it's not deep enough. This blade has a little bit of deflection, thicker, and it has a long blade length. The reason the Stanley blades or X-Acto knife blades have so much deflect is because they have the score lines in them. They're designed to break away so that you can break them away and have a sharper tip. However, that works against the blade in the sense of working with foam. So all those considerations should be taken into account. I'm not going to say that you can't work with any of those. I'm just kind of giving my preference and kind of some of the considerations to make when you're working with that. Okay, so once you've selected the appropriate thickness of foam and you've cut it to the proper dimensions for your terrain feature, we're going to want to work on preparing the foam to accept adhesion to whatever substrate you've selected. So if you're using a thicker substrate, we've talked about this, warp is probably not an issue. However, the thinner you go with the substrate, the more likelihood that you'll have warp, and the more importance you want to pay to the sort of the counteracting of that warping feature. So I'm going to show you a couple ways to prepare foam, and I use probably all of these techniques just depending on what terrain job I'm doing. So first and foremost, let's talk about this one here. So I've painted this one side with black paint, and I use this for a couple things. One, I use it as an indicator. Basically, I'm going to adhere the painted surface down. I also use it as a way of sealing the foam. Typically, I'll go 2 layers of paint, but I just use one here for the purposes of demonstration because I want to show you why I do this and kind of the importance of this. This is probably the cheapest preparation technique, and this is why I've selected it for the video, or one example rather, because you just use cheap acrylic paint, you paint it out, you give it a couple layers, and it kind of seals off your foam. This one here on the back side, what I've done is I've actually brushed a thick layer of weld bond. So I've used some weld bond glue here. If you guys seen any of my videos going back like 10 years, I love weld bond. I talk about it all the time. So weld bond is just a really, really thick PVA glue. The water content is quite low in it, so it's very, very thick. As it says, it dries crystal clear. It's very quick to dry surface level. You just have to be careful that you don't put it too thick, because if you do it too thick, the underside doesn't dry because the top layer gets a film and it takes forever. But I've prepared a layer on here. So I've taken some weld bond, I've brushed it over. I'm not sure if the camera will pick up the sheen, but it's very, very shiny. I mixed it with a little bit of black paint just so that you guys would be able to see in fact that I did have a layer on here. So this is obviously a more expensive preparation technique because you're using a more expensive product. However, the coverage and the sealing of this is far better than the black paint. However, they are very similar in effect. This is just more effective. And then this 1.5 inch piece of foam I've not prepared at all. And I want to show you why it's important to kind of prepare your foam if in fact you use any of the adhesion techniques that I'm going to show you. So when I talk about adhesion, what I'm talking about is taking the actual foam and laminating it onto the surface that you're going to work with. It doesn't matter if you're using 1/2 inch MDF or even thin cardboard, you're going to need to have some way of adhering your foam onto that surface. If you're just using straight foam like an 1.5 inch base or a 2 inch base, obviously that's not going to be as important for you. However, you will eventually need to laminate some base layer material onto your foam, and that's important. We'll cover that in another video. However, for the purposes of this, what I'm talking about is laminating your foam onto a substrate. There's a couple important considerations to make as well for this. The fact that you're going to want to make sure that the foam doesn't impact your base layer. Foam has a memory, so if you get a sheet of foam, what you're going to notice is that it's going to have a bow or a slight bend to the foam. It's almost inevitable. Every sheet that I've ever had has some sort of flex or bow to it. The thicker sheets, obviously, it's a little less evident, and the thinner ones, it's a little more prominent. However, one of the things you have to worry about is that the thicker sheets have a little bit more pull. So when you glue these down onto a thin layer, even a small piece like this, it actually can flex your base layer up. So it's really important that you combat that, and I'll tell you a couple ways that you can do that. The thinner sheets have a more obvious bow. I can actually see it in this one. It's very subtle probably on camera. However, I can see it from my angle. And this has more flex, which means that when you go to laminate it, you need to make sure that you adhere the surface to your substrate. Otherwise, you're going to get a flexing or a vaulting, and you won't have much adhesion. So let's first talk about how I've prepared these and why I've done this. If you go ahead and put any sort of glue, so obviously I'm going to glue this prepared surface down, likewise this painted surface down, and here I didn't prepare any surface, so it doesn't really matter what I glue down. However, a couple other things to consider. Here it's very clean, there's no paint, there's no markings. Here there is marking, so typically, not for the purpose of this video, but typically what I'll do is I'll actually try to glue down the writing side. This just helps me later to, when I brush on my base layer or my color layer, I don't have to avoid the writing, because although this is going to be painted eventually, if I do a very thin layer, and one of the things I like to use is Woodland Scenic's earth tone. It's a very thin paint. It's really nice, but it's really thin, and it takes several coats to coat over this black writing. So I typically will try to just use a nice clean surface. However, I didn't in this particular case. But now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about gluing the surface down. So my preferred method before was actually just going with another layer of weld bond. And the natural tendency for most folks is to think that if I want proper adhesion, I need to have full coverage. I would caution against that, and here's why. If I were to fully coat this piece of foam and glue it down, when I do that, if my layer of substrate is thin, what happens is that it adheres so well that because the foam is thicker often than that really thin substrate, it will flex, it will pull your substrate up, and you'll get a bowing of your substrate that follows the natural curvature of the foam. And that's an issue because you don't want that. If you go the opposite way, what happens is you can get a bowing in the middle, and it may not be as evident. However, you'll get a flex and you'll get a vaulting, and when I push down on it, I'll get a sort of a springy action. So you want to avoid that. There's a couple ways that you can do that. And one is with the application of the glue, the other is actually manipulating the material. So what I did over here is I prepared, this is a 3mm MDF substrate, and you'll notice that what I did with the foam here, I used a really thick piece of foam, and it had a little bit of vaulting in it. It's a little harder to see, but there's a little bit of a concave shape right here. And what I've done is I've actually glued the foam sideways. So if you are willing to cut your piece of foam sideways, it doesn't matter where the curvature is because you're going to use this nice straight cut edge. And so there's going to be no natural memory of the foam trying to flex your substrate. So although this is very thin, and what I did here is I actually did a full application of glue all along there just to make sure I had as much glue as possible, just trying to test the strength of the foam, just trying to see if it would flex this. However, it's been here for 2 days now, and I have zero flex. There's no bowing here, there's no warping, nothing. Even though I have the ends with no foam on it, there's no flexing there. So because I've turned it sideways, I've sort of tricked the foam into not trying to flex my substrate. However, this way of cutting the foam is not always most efficient because the sheets come in flat layers that are like this, and you may have to cover a large surface area. However, if you're doing a small piece of area terrain, really nice trick, you can use a thin substrate, turn your foam sideways, and you don't have to worry about flex or warp. So just a little tip there. But let's talk about the more natural application, or probably the more practical application, and that's laying sheets of foam on MDF surfaces. So for that, like I said, the natural tendency is, hey, I'm going to put a full coverage on here because I want to adhere this sheet down and I want to make sure it never moves. I would caution against that, and the reason being is that exactly what I talked about, that memory. So when you go to glue this down, what you need to do is just put dots sporadically over your foam. Make sure you pay close attention to the corners, a couple in the middle, and what that does is it does the adhesion part of things. It it grips to your substrate. However, it's pulling in so many different random locations that the foam itself doesn't try to flex everything up. It gets adherence, it's just pulling sporadically, and it eliminates, or reduces, I should say, the tendency for the foam to want to warp your substrate. So it's a really quick and easy trick. Don't flatten it out over the whole thing, just put it down. When you put it down, give it a little wiggle just so that you can get a little bit of a spreading of the glue, and that will allow proper adhesion. And what it will actually do too is it'll give a little bit of an air layer at first to kind of get in there and start sealing, start curing this glue. So that's really important as well. Let's just say though, this was my preferred technique before. However, what I find with this is that even doing that over a full sheet, an 8x4 or a 4x6 or a 3x6, it takes some time. And what happens is by the time I get all the dots down, some of my glue has already started to dry, and that's not really what I'm looking for. So I've actually moved to using spray adhesive, and the one I'm particularly very keen on right now is the Gorilla Glue spray adhesive. It's a heavy duty spray adhesive. There's lots out there. There's 3M, Super 77. They're all kinds. That's another 3M product. There's all kinds of glues out there, but I really like this one. And what I do with this is I coat one surface and I coat the other, and then I just stick them together. And with this, I do get a full coverage. However, I've found that because the layer is very thin, it doesn't have any sort of need to have air in there curing. It doesn't tend to warp my surface. Now, I have noticed that it will, with some thicker foam, warp a 3mm MDF piece. So with that, I would use the same technique of turning it sideways. However, just straight application over full sheets, it's so much quicker to use this than it is the weld bond. And because of the speed and the efficiency of it, I really do like that. However, it is an aerosol product, so spraying it directly on foam that's not sealed will create some problems. So I'm going to actually take a little bit of this. I'm going to shake it off camera, so I'll speed this part up so you don't have to hear this. So I just quickly sprayed that off camera, and I've come back and I've sprayed a little bit on all of these. So immediately what you're going to notice is that there's a little bit of a reaction happening. Clearly, this right here, straight aerosol onto the foam, is eating away the surface. Why is that a problem? Well, let's just say I had this piece of foam and I was attempting to adhere it to here. Well, I'm going to hold those two together, and I have almost zero adherence. Why? Well, because it's created a divot here, and although this is actually sticky, you can see, it is recessed to the point where I can no longer get adhesion between the two surfaces. If I were to spray it here and here, I would just get a vaulting and I would never get adherence. Now, let's go to the painted surface. It is less so, however, it is still eating through just the paint. I'll stick that together and you can see it's a little bit less, so I'm getting a little bit of adhesion. However, by the time this finishes eating through that foam, I'm not going to have any adhesion. Now this one here that I prepared with the glue, if you remember, weld bond layer, the weld bond layer creates kind of like a film. So stick these two together, and this is a single layer and I'm sticking it together, but you can already see, and I'm using some force to pull that apart, I have adhesion. And if I left that to dry, I would start to get pretty good adhesion between that. You'll notice so much adhesion, the fact that it pulled away the film layer that I had with the glue. So that's quite powerful immediately out of the can. What you want to do is you want to have the two layers go together. Ideally, you always want to spray both sides. That's better adhesion. And then you'll get a quick bond. You use a little bit of weight. It doesn't have to be a ton. You don't want to, again, artificially create any warp or flex to the foam by putting too much weight on there. That's another mistake that a lot of people make, is they feel that they need to like pound on like 80 pounds of weight. What I tend to do is I put a little bit more than finger pressure on there just to get the bond between those. So you can hear that bond. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to take a knife, and I'm going to use my knife here. Just going to extend that out a little bit, not quite so much. I'm just going to cut this piece in half. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and quickly spray this off cam. I'm going to use both sides, or spray both sides rather. You need to give it, I think the can recommends about like 30 to 60 seconds to kind of like basically let the aerosol sort of flow off here. That goes pretty quick. Give it a little time to kind of get tacky. You're going to notice that this is going to eat through because we've sort of ripped away that glue. I typically give it about 30 seconds, give it a press together. I'll just put my hand on it. Again, I'm just using arm weight here. I'm not even really pressing down. And I want to do this in real time just to kind of give you a sense of how quickly you can sort of achieve adhesion. One of the things with the weld bond, just as I'm waiting for this to dry, one of the things with the weld bond, when you're using that, it's going to kind of have a floating surface. And one of the mistakes that a lot of people make when they put all that weight on is they get a really nice placement. They work really hard to get the edges lined up. They go ahead and put the weight on, and then the weight sort of creates a slump or a slide, and then it moves ever so slightly. And you think it's really good, and you leave it 24 hours, and you come back only to find that you've kind of skewed the foam. And that's a real problem, especially if you're trying to achieve a real tight seam or kind of have it flow across multiple boards. So there's nothing more disheartening than coming down to find out you have proper adhesion in the wrong location. So let's go ahead and remove my hand here. Now I will be able to pull this apart. However, you can see that that's pretty significant in terms of pulling. I'm using considerable force there. I can re-adhere this as well, and you can see just how quickly I'm getting adhesion. So you can imagine if you leave this for a few hours, and if your surface is this way, and there's probably no chance that somebody's going to take a 4x6 sheet of your foam and yank it off, this is going to give you a really nice tight bond. And you saw how quickly I did it. And a 4x6 sheet, if you're doing it in small, like 2x2 sections or whatever have you, for sections, it just adheres super quick. It's really quick and easy to use. It's probably, I recommend probably about 1 can to do 1 surface. You won't use more than a can to do an average tabletop surface. You definitely wouldn't use a whole thing of glue, but if you're gonna buy a bottle of this stuff, similar size, like what you need, it's probably going to be about the exact same cost. This may actually be a little bit cheaper. Use this in a ventilated area. Make sure you wear a mask if you're going to spray a lot of this, of course. And that's kind of really what you need to worry about this. But it's super quick and easy, and I can't recommend something more than this. It doesn't have to be Gorilla brand specifically, but the spray adhesive, as you've seen, works great. However, a little bit of prep work. Don't let this happen to your surface, because this looks absolutely terrible. And here's the worst thing. If you put this on and you immediately press it down, you may not know this is happening. What's going to happen is you're going to get quick adhesion. It's going to eat through the foam, and then you'll come down in 24 hours, move your foam, and it's going to slide right off your table because it's just going to be vaulted and it's going to be terrible. So that needs to happen. This, again, look at that paint. It does a little bit of protection. Multiple layers will do a little bit better. However, there's no substitute for creating a nice thick layer with a PVA glue. It doesn't have to be weld bond or something similar. So I know this is a lot on adhesive, but I would say this is probably the most important step to preparing foam. A lot of people just don't know necessarily how to tackle foam. Here's another quick tip that I wanted to tell you guys. Let's just say, for example, you had a little bit of delamination or something like that. You may want to go in and you're like, oh, I'll just fix up with super glue. Super glue fixes everything. Let me just quickly show you, and you guys probably know this. You've probably seen super glue applied to foam before, but if you haven't, let's just have a look. This is the gap filling super glue, so it's thick, and then here's some really thin watered down stuff. And I'm just going to put this on the foam here, and just I'm going to leave it for a second. So just to quickly recap, if you're doing a small piece with a thin substrate, try to turn your foam sideways to take out that memory. If you're gluing big surfaces, check the foam, make sure it doesn't have a lot of warp into it. If it does, just make sure that your substrate's thick enough to sort of be stronger than the foam itself, and make sure you prepare your foam. So what I did for this, just as this is kind of eating through the foam here a little bit, is I put the glue down, I left it till the next day, I went back, and then as you see, I left it, it was about 24 hours, probably about 30 hours actually. But then I just do the spray adhesive really quick and easy. This bond is just gonna get stronger and stronger as we go. And you'll also notice I can pull this apart and I can do some repositioning. So if it happens to sort of flex or flow on you, take a look at it and you can pull it off and put it back on. You're only gonna be able to do that for a little while, because after that it's going to be such an adherence, you won't be able to move it. So so as you can see right here, the gap filling glue, the super glue, it will eat through the foam. However, it works a lot slower than the thin glue. The thin glue is it's so thin, it flows into the pores of the foam. Although it doesn't even look like the foam has pores, it does have cells. It will flow into the foam and it actually starts eroding it from the underside. So it penetrates as basically as far as it can. Then it sort of stops, and then it starts to eat through the foam. So in a few minutes, if I were to come in here with like a tool or a popsicle stick or a toothpick, I can actually pull all of this inside out. And what it will do is it will kind of create a trough. I discovered this because I was looking for ways to eat into the foam that was a little bit more natural than sort of dremeling out. And I actually use this to create my lava troughs on my Solus table. So there is an application that you could use the glue for, and it creates this really cool natural look. However, it is not something that you want to use to adhere your foam to a substrate, because much like the adhesive coming out of the spray can with the aerosol, it just eats and erodes the foam. This thick glue will do the exact same thing. It's just a little bit of a slower process. So again, don't use super glues. Don't use adhesives that have aerosol unless it's protected, because you can see this is a significant divot at this point. Protect your surface if you're going to use any of those materials. Spray adhesive much quicker than the weld bond. If you're going to use a PVA, just do it in a dot form. Don't spread it out over the whole thing. So that's pretty much all I can tell you guys on adhesives working with foam. So what we're going to do in the final part of this video is we're going to talk about what happens if you get a gouge or a chip or a broken corner in preparation of your substrate. Okay guys, so we're back with our foam. We have our foam, it's laminated now. You know, we wanted to go 2 inches. We only had 2 1-inch sections, so we laminated that, spray adhesive, we're good. We got it attached to our substrate, which we don't have here, but just imagine that we did. And now we're ready to kind of start working. However, while we were cutting and working, what happened was I dropped my pair of pliers and it created a big gouge. It dented my foam. I have a chip now. I don't have a nice flat surface and I wanted to work with that. However, that wasn't the only accident that happened. What also happened was while I was taking a corner measurement, I wasn't paying attention and I chipped off a piece of my corner. And now I have this unsightly sort of chip on the corner. I don't have that nice squared edge. I'm gonna do a trim later and I'm gonna have this gap in the corner, and that's not great. And worse than that, while I was leaning over to measure something, what happened was I put my elbow in and I got this weird divot. So it's not really terrible, but I got this weird undulation now in an otherwise flat surface. So now I have all kinds of problems and I need to fix them. So here's the best thing. All 3 of these problems I can fix with the exact same product. But this foam putty is super awesome to work with. I like it because it's lightweight. It goes a long way. You're not using this to do a lot of sculpting or anything like that, so you're not going to be using a ton of it, so it lasts a while. I think this maybe is my 3rd container that I've ever used in all of my terrain making years. So it lasts. I think the last one it dried up before I got to use it. But let's have a look at this. And so the product itself is kind of cool. It's really fluffy. It's almost like I don't know how to describe it really. It's not, it kind of feels like an icing sugar, and it looks like an icing sugar, and it gets a little bit dry on the top. But what happens is as you stir it and you sort of heat the product up, it starts to get a little bit more malleable and manipulatable, and that's kind of how we want it. So I'm just going to do that exact thing and just sort of mix it up here. I also want to caveat this with, I'm going to use some sculpting tools. However, I'm also going to show you the most important sculpting tool and something that you can have readily available. So you do not need to have a sculpting tool. In fact, you can use this to do anything that I'm going to do here. So I'll probably use this for some of it too. So what you do with this is you basically go and start correcting the problems that you had. So remember this chip, when I drop the pliers, what you're going to do is you're going to take the foam putty and you want to jam the foam putty in to the crevice, the hole. And what I mean by that is bring it to your trouble spot and just literally start smashing it down. And you'll notice how it keeps squeezing out, and I keep going back in, and what I'm doing is I'm going to ensure that I have fully packed that divot. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start scraping the foam putty over the section. And I'm going to constantly keep that pressure, that downward pressure on that hole. And there we go. And so what I've done here is I filled in the mistake section. However, what's going to happen is it's going to have a slight depression. So once this hardens, I'm going to need to go back and do just a little bit more to perfectly level that off. So it's a little hard to see. It looks like it's filled in. There's a little bit of a divot, and that's just because I can't get enough back pressure on it without having some displacement. So once this hardens, this first layer, I'll go back and I'll just do a little bit of a surface layer to that, and it will fill that hole in, and I'll never know that I had an issue. If you also like, what you can do is you can leave a little bit on top, and then you could just do a sand of this because it will sand afterwards. I prefer, however, to not do this method. Only reason being is there's a strong likelihood when you go in with sanding that you're going to actually have to press your hand down, or if you're using a sanding block, there's potential that you could drop or chip or even gouge something that you don't want to. So I feel much safer in doing a base layer and then coming in with just a little bit more afterwards. I don't have to worry about sanding. Now, if you like to do that, it's perfectly sandable. That's what the product recommends. I just like the double application, the 2-layer application. Just eliminates any chances that I'm going to sand something off or gouge or chip something that I don't want. This is literally what I'm here to do, is to fix problems that I wasn't paying attention to or I was not careful enough before. So let's go back to the elbow impression. So it's in there. It's really hard to see, but let's put a little bit of foam putty in that space. So again, I'm just going to kind of fill the area. In this case, I'm going to spread it out, and I'm going to drag my tool along. And you kind of see what I'm doing. I'm very lightly scraping the excess off. So I'm just going to same thing here, just lightly scrape it over my trouble area. It's a slight depression, of course. It wasn't significant, but I'm just filling that section in. And when this dries, I'll do a second layer. It's going to be very subtle, but I filled in that slight depression, and that just fixes that little divot. And what this is doing is it's just recalibrating your surface back to a flat surface. You work really hard to get to this point, and this is just kind of like a band-aid for it. Rather than coming in with something complex and have to put sheeting over it or like trying to fill it with another material, this stuff is super easy. It just goes over, glides over. You can lightly sand it if you want, but like I said, if you just do a little bit and then do a second layer, you can kind of scrape that down, and you'll have a little bit of a harder surface to work with because this stuff will go hard, and then you can just keep scraping it until you get there, and it's it's a nice way to correct problems that are inevitable and things that happen all the time. I do it all the time, as careful as I can be. I drop something, I chip something, I'm not paying attention, I lean on something. It's just all things, and this is the reason I made this part of the video, is that you will come across things like this. And there's nothing worse than working really hard to prepare something only to have it kind of, a small mistake happen. So the most common ones, and probably the ones that people think, and if you look around and you've seen people with foam and foam things, there's chips in foam everywhere. It happens. So how do you go ahead and fix this? Well, the premise is exactly the same. You're going to pack the corner, and you're just going to fill that corner right up. And you're going to sandwich it all in there. You want to make sure you get proper adhesion. I'm just going to switch over to my sculpting tool just to show you that it is, sometimes nice to have a little bit smaller tools, something that you can manipulate and kind of square off the corners. And so what I'm doing is I'm concentrating here on just kind of getting these two edges, and then I'm going to do the likewise on the top here. Excess goes back in the container. I can pull that back out as needed. And I did a pretty significant gouge here just because I want to kind of show you that you can really fix almost anything. Those gouges that you kind of have on the side, like let's say your knife sort of got hung up, or you dropped it, or whatever. However a gouge can occur in foam, until it gets a base layer on it, it's fair game. It's open game to be hit, chipped, damaged. So there you go. That's basically redefine the corner, and I can continually reshape that. When this hardens, when it is fully dry, like I said, run your sanding block. This is an easy spot. You run your sanding block here, you run the sanding block there. If it's still not square enough, you go back in with a little bit of foam putty. You build it up. This piece right here, same thing, right? I'm gonna run my next layer over it. If it's not, it's basically filled up. There's a small, slight indentation, probably nothing more than what's naturally in the foam. However, I know that I drop a tool there, so I want to make sure I fix that location. This one here, small elbow divot, same thing. You can fix it up. Another great use for this, and I'll show you really quickly. Say you're building a terrain feature and you actually have layers, like you didn't have thick enough foam, or you had to layer up your foam, and you kind of get these lines in here. Well, one of the things that will happen when you go to do your next layer, if there's a gap there, your material is going to suck in there. However, if you take some of this foam putty and get it on the gap, you can just quickly and easily backfill that gap. Scrape that off, and that's going to effectively hide that gap. So when you put your next layer on, whatever it is, it's going to go right over that. It's going to basically think that that was the same layer as your foam, and you won't get any material sucking in there, because what happens when you get material sort of suck into a crevice, you get a natural depression in the material. So all your hard work of kind of taking out the striations, it's going to be in there because your material is going to suck in, it's going to adhere and dry, and you're going to get unsightly lines that you probably don't want. Of course, if you want those lines, then don't fill them in. If you're hoping to achieve the look of striation, then probably what I'm telling you right now won't work. However, this is a super quick and easy way. Not only that, but if you have any delamination, or the foam's a little bit vaulted, like I said, it's got that little bit of natural memory, and that's a really this is a really easy way to tell you exactly what I told, or show you exactly what I told you before. That vaulting is just the natural vault in the foam itself. It just doesn't have a 90. It just doesn't have a parallel angle to the adjoining foam, and so that little bit of a gap is just that natural bend. Put a little bit of foam putty in there, you take that out, and you achieve kind of a solid piece going forward. So great use of a product. The product is amazing. It works. It's very user friendly. You guys seen how quickly I'm able to work with this. It stays malleable. and kind of keep manipulating that. You'll see it starting to harden up. It says on here, what's the recommendation of time? Does it have a recommendation of time? I want to say basically what I do most often is I leave it for about 12 hours, and then I'll come back in and do my second layer. And then I'll leave it for another 12 hours, and at that point I can come back in, I can sand it, you can paint it. I sometimes use this to fill like screw holes or things like that, kind of like you'd use a spackle. It's just, it's a little bit lighter weight than that, and I find that it's sands a little bit nicer because it doesn't pick up grid lines of the sandpaper. It's very, very fine, it's a powder, and so it just basically tends to sand quite smoothly, no matter what sandpaper you use. So really fun and easy to use. It does say here too, if it gets a little bit too dry, that you can mix in a little bit of water. It's 1 teaspoon per cup. So this is just under 2 cups, so you're not adding a lot of liquid. And I recommend if you're going to rehydrate this material, you do so in a secondary cup. Don't go ahead and throw moisture into this one here, because if you don't get the ratio right, you're going to probably make this too soupy, and it won't work for you in the future. So because it does need to be a little bit dry to kind of manipulate. So there you guys go. Now we've basically, like I said, we've got the proper foam for the job. We've done the adherence. We've done the proper cutting. We know how to prepare it. We've fixed the mistakes that we know are going to happen. And now we're ready to actually get ready to start laying some base layer on this foam, your area terrain piece, or the carving the terrain, what have you. Whatever you're looking to do, you are now basically at that stage. So in the upcoming videos, what we'll do is we'll take these a little bit further. First video after this one will be base layering. I'll talk about how to prepare it with a textured surface, how to prepare it with straight flock, how to do a snow preparation, and how to do sort of a sand layer. So I'll do 4 different types of basing. Probably those will give you enough of a footstep into kind of whatever project you're looking for. They have some similarities, however, some of them have a slightly different application. All of them can work directly off the foam surface. So if you've been following along, you kind of get your base layer ready, and then by the time the next video comes out, you guys should have a start to your terrain project. But don't let the video stop you, and definitely I encourage you guys to post up what you're doing. Let me know what you're working on. If you have any questions, comments about what you've seen here or any other videos, don't hesitate to contact me. So thanks for watching, guys. I'm Sean Morse for the Terrain Studio. Cheers.